Kim Jong-il, How a Soviet Child Became a Nuclear Tyrant. This is an educational documentary presented for historical and educational purposes only. Hey guys, tonight we step into a frozen forest at the edge of an empire, where snow gathers on pine branches and the sky hangs low and metallic over a small Soviet military camp. You can almost hear the crunch of boots in the ice, the distant rumble of artillery carried faintly from a war that is tearing continents apart. Somewhere in this wintry blur of 1941, or perhaps 1942, even the date bends under politics. A child is born to a Korean guerrilla fighter and his wife, both exiled from their occupied homeland. You probably won't survive this. Not the cold, not the hunger, not the sweeping machinery of ideology grinding through human lives like gears in a steel factory. So, before we go any further, if this quiet space makes you feel even a little less alone, you can like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you lying awake in a quiet room at 2 am? Or maybe starting your day in a rainy city, eyes still heavy? Drop your time and place in the comments. Let's remind each other we're not alone out here. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey, together, here on Timeless Sleep. You are born, officially, on February 16th, 1942, beneath the sacred slopes of Mount Baekdu, a volcano straddling the border of Korea and China, its peak forever wrapped in nationalist myth. At least, that is the version printed in textbooks decades later, the one children memorize in neat rows. In that story, a double rainbow appears in the sky at the moment of your birth, and a new star rises over the mountain as if the cosmos itself is drafting your biography. But if you peel back the layers of state narrative, you find something colder and more prosaic, Soviet military records indicating you were born a year earlier, in 1941, in a village near Khabarovsk in the Soviet Far East, where your father serves in the Red Army's 88th Separate Rifle Brigade. History, you discover early, even if you don't yet have the words for it, is malleable. It can be sculpted like wet clay. Your father, Kim Il-sung, is not yet the eternal president he will become. He is a guerrilla commander fighting against Japanese occupation forces in Korea, a man whose survival depends on alliances and adaptability. When Japanese crackdowns intensify in the late 1930s, he and other anti-Japanese fighters retreat into the Soviet Union, where Moscow trains and equips them. This is a mainstream documented fact. Kim Il-sung served with Soviet forces during World War II, adopting the rank of captain and the Russian name Yuri Asenovich Kim for his son Yu. In the barracks, Russian lullabies mix with Korean whispers. Snow replaces the rice paddies of your ancestral homeland. Your earliest world is not the rugged Korean mountain of propaganda posters, but a wooden hut near a Soviet airfield. You grow up in an atmosphere heavy with ideology. Even before you can read, words like revolution, imperialism, and liberation float through conversations like incense smoke. The Soviet Union is locked in existential war with Nazi Germany. Your father studies tactics, absorbs Marxist-Leninist doctrine more deeply, and learns how power consolidates in a centralized party structure. You, a small child bundled in thick wool, toddle across floors that creak under military boots. It is not glamorous, but it is formative. You learn that survival requires discipline. You learn that enemies are real, even if you cannot yet picture them. When World War II ends in 1945, the geopolitical chessboard shifts overnight. Japan surrenders. The Korean peninsula, liberated from decades of colonial rule, is abruptly divided along the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union occupies the north, the United States occupies the south. It is one of those historical decisions made with a pencil line on a map, a quiet administrative act that will echo for generations. You return to Korea as part of a Soviet-backed cadre, carried into a land that has never seen you before, but will one day be told you were born of its sacred soil. Pyongyang becomes your new stage. The city in the late 1940s is scarred and fragile. Buildings still show the bruises of occupation. Yet within these streets, your father rises quickly. Backed by Soviet authorities, he consolidates rival factions and is installed as the leader of the new Democratic People's Republic of Korea in 1948. You are a child watching your father transform into a head of state. Imagine the psychological imprint. One day he is a uniformed officer, the next, portraits of him hang in classrooms. Power becomes domestic, almost ordinary, like a piece of furniture in the living room. Then comes the Korean War in 1950. You are 8 or 9 years old when the peninsula erupts into violence. The war begins when North Korean forces cross the 38th parallel, seeking reunification by force. It becomes a brutal international conflict, drawing in United Nations forces led by the United States and Chinese troops supporting the North. Pyongyang is bombed heavily. At times, you are evacuated for safety. This is not abstract geopolitics. It is the thud of explosions in the distance, the hurried packing of belongings. The war devastates infrastructure and kills millions. When an armistice is signed in 1953, the peninsula remains divided. The border hardens into one of the most militarized zones on Earth. Childhood in your case is less about playgrounds and more about observation. You watch how your father manages reconstruction. You see how he eliminates rivals within the party, consolidating a cult of personality. Streets are renamed, songs are written in his honour. You absorb the lesson that narrative is armour. If people believe strongly enough in a story, it becomes unassailable. One quirky tidbit from these years, your official biographies later claim you could walk at 3 weeks old and speak at 8 weeks, a level of infant prodigy that would make paediatricians blink twice. These stories are not meant to be questioned. They are meant to signal destiny. As you grow into adolescence, your education is carefully curated. You attend elite schools in Pyongyang, surrounded by the children of party elites. Your curriculum is steeped in ideology and military history. You reportedly spend time in China during part of your schooling, observing another communist system in action. The world outside the socialist bloc remains distant, filtered through carefully controlled information. In your textbooks, capitalism is chaotic and cruel. Your system is righteous and scientific. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, North Korea under your father embarks on rapid industrialization. Factories rise. Collective farms expand. There is genuine economic growth in these early decades, supported by Soviet and Chinese aid. You witness the construction of a state that prides itself on self-reliance. Hooche, the ideology your father develops, emphasizing national independence and centralized authority. Hooche will become more than a doctrine. It will be the philosophical spine of your eventual rule. At home, however, life is layered. You are not just a citizen. You are the heir, though not yet officially declared. Your mother, Kim Jong-suk, dies when you are young, in 1949, a loss that deepens the myth around her as a revolutionary heroine. Grief mixes with propaganda. Personal memory is absorbed into national legend. You learn early that even sorrow can be political. In your teenage years, you develop a fascination with cinema, a detail both mainstream and revealing. Films, you realise, are powerful conveyors of emotion and loyalty. A well-crafted scene can make an audience weep for a leader they have never met. This interest in culture will later become a cornerstone of your political strategy, but for now it is a young man sitting in darkened rooms, watching reels flicker across a screen. You stand at the intersection of two worlds, the harsh, pragmatic reality of post-war geopolitics and the shimmering, carefully constructed myth of revolutionary destiny. Your birth date itself is contested, but your trajectory is not. You are being shaped by war, by ideology, by a father who understands that control over history is as important as control over armies. And as the snow melts each spring over Pyongyang's avenues, you move quietly from childhood into something far more deliberate, the machinery of succession already beginning to hum beneath the surface. You grow up inside a country that is busy inventing you, not just raising you, inventing you. By the early 1960s, North Korea is no longer merely rebuilding from war, it is constructing a mythology so dense and polished that it begins to feel like climate, like air pressure. And you, moving through wide Pyongyang boulevards lined with new concrete apartments and red banners, are at the centre of a story that grows more elaborate each year. Official biographies now insist you were born on Mount Pekchu in a secret guerrilla camp, beneath a glowing star and a sky split by twin rainbows. The Soviet birth certificate quietly disappears from public memory. The mountain becomes your cradle, sacred and volcanic, tying your existence to Korean nationalist symbolism that predates communism itself. It is a clever fusion, Marxist-Leninist structure wrapped in ancient myth. You are still a young man, but already the state's cultural machinery orbits you. Schools teach children songs about your father's revolutionary genius. Murals bloom across public buildings, depicting anti-Japanese fighters charging heroically through snowdrifts. The message is consistent. History flows in a straight line from guerrilla resistance to your family's leadership. In 1964, you graduate from Kim-il, Sung University, reportedly with a degree in political economy. Whether you are an exceptional student or simply an inevitable one almost doesn't matter. What matters is that you emerge credentialed, ideologically polished, and ready to step into the party's inner workings. The Workers' Party of Korea becomes your apprenticeship ground. This is where you begin to understand the mechanics of control at a granular level. North Korea's political structure is centralized, disciplined, and relentless in its messaging. Departments oversee propaganda, organization, security, and military affairs. You are assigned to the Organization and Guidance Department, a body so powerful that it functions as the nervous system of the regime. Through it, appointments are monitored, loyalty is assessed, and ideological purity is enforced. It is not glamorous work. It is paperwork, evaluations, quiet reports on who attended which meeting and who clapped with sufficient enthusiasm. But it is here that you learn the most important lesson of authoritarian survival. Power is not only seized, it is curated daily. One mainstream historical fact stands firm in this era. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, you play a growing role in strengthening the cult of personality around your father. Portraits of Kim Il-sung become mandatory in homes and offices. Citizens are required to wear badges bearing his image. Revolutionary operas and films dramatize his exploits. And you, with your fascination for cinema, lean into this cultural front with particular intensity. You reportedly critique scripts personally, insisting on emotional clarity and unwavering loyalty in every frame. In a system where information from outside is tightly restricted, domestic art becomes a powerful instrument. A well-timed film can shape how an entire generation interprets sacrifice. There is a quirky, almost surreal detail from these years that hints at your peculiar blend of cultural obsession and authority. You allegedly maintain an enormous personal film archive, eventually collecting tens of thousands of movies from around the world. While ordinary citizens risk punishment for unauthorized foreign media, you immerse yourself in everything, from Soviet epics to Western thrillers. It is as if you are studying the emotional grammar of storytelling, searching for techniques that can be repurposed for state narratives. One can almost picture you in a dim private screening room, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling, pausing a scene to discuss pacing. It would be comical if it weren't so consequential. Meanwhile, geopolitics remains tense. The Korean peninsula is technically still at war. The 1953 armistice halted fighting, but did not establish peace. Skirmishes flare intermittently along the demilitarized zone. In 1968, North Korean commandos attempt to assassinate South Korean President Park Chung-hee in the Blue House raid, a brazen operation that fails but signals ongoing hostility. That same year, North Korea captures the Us Pueblo, an American intelligence ship, holding its crew captive for nearly a year. These incidents reinforce a siege mentality within the North. You internalize the narrative that the outside world is perpetually plotting invasion, that vigilance is survival. Inside the party, however, threats are more subtle. Rival factions linger, individuals with roots in China, in the Soviet Union, in domestic guerrilla movements. Your father systematically sidelines them throughout the 1960s, but the architecture of succession is still delicate. North Korea is not a monarchy in theory, it is a socialist republic. The idea of hereditary leadership must be woven carefully into ideological fabric. By the early 1970s, you begin appearing more prominently in official events. Your name surfaces in state media with increasing frequency. It is a gradual unveiling, like a curtain lifting, inch by inch. In 1974, you are formally designated as your father's successor within the party, though this is not broadcast with flamboyant ceremony. Instead, it is embedded in party congress decisions and elite consensus. The groundwork has been laid. You are portrayed as the most loyal student of Kim Il-sung's thought, the guardian of Juche ideology. The narrative shifts subtly from collective revolutionary leadership to familial continuity. The state's mythology adapts again, this time to normalize the idea that the revolution's bloodline is literal. As you assume greater responsibility, you double down on ideological campaigns. The 10 principles for the establishment of a monolithic ideological system become central to daily life, demanding absolute loyalty to the leader. These principles function almost like commandments, structuring behavior from factory floors to university classrooms. You oversee their implementation with meticulous attention. Reports flow upward. Deviations are corrected. The system tightens, not dramatically, but steadily, like a screw turning with deliberate patience. Yet even within this rigidity, you cultivate an image of modernity. You champion science and technology projects, promote large-scale public works, and encourage grand cultural festivals. The Arirang Mass Games, though expanded later, have roots in this era of orchestrated spectacle, tens of thousands of performers moving in synchronized precision, forming images of the leader and the nation. It is propaganda as choreography, ideology expressed through human bodies arranged in perfect symmetry. Watching from a reviewing stand, you see how individual identity dissolves into collective performance. There is a strange duality in your development. On one hand, you are methodical, bureaucratic, intensely focused on organizational control. On the other, you indulge in luxuries inaccessible to ordinary citizens, imported cognac, fine cars, private villas. The gap between ruler and ruled widens, though it is rarely acknowledged publicly. For most North Koreans, information about your lifestyle is non-existent. What they see are carefully staged images, you inspecting factories, offering on-the-spot guidance, smiling benevolently as workers applaud. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union and China, once united in supporting your father, are themselves drifting apart ideologically. The Sino-Soviet split complicates North Korea's diplomatic balancing act. You observe how your father maneuvers between these powers, extracting aid while preserving autonomy. It reinforces a lesson you will carry into your own rule: isolation can be weaponized. Playing larger powers against one another is not just diplomacy, it is survival strategy. Through all of this, the myth around your birth and destiny continues to solidify. Children memorize stories of your precocious brilliance. Teachers recount anecdotes of your strategic insights as a teenager. Reality and legend braid together so tightly that disentangling them becomes nearly impossible. And you, standing at the threshold of eventual leadership, seem to understand that perception is as decisive as policy. As the 1980s approach, your father ages. His public appearances remain vigorous, but time moves in one direction only. You are no longer just the son of a revolutionary hero, you are the carefully engineered continuation of his authority. The state has rehearsed your ascent for years, but people have been conditioned to accept it. And beneath the surface calm of Pyongyang's wide avenues, the machinery of dynastic socialism hums steadily, preparing for the moment when you will step fully into the spotlight, not as a supporting figure, but as the axis around which the entire system will turn. You step deeper into the machinery, and by the late 1970s the air around you feels charged, as if the entire state is quietly rehearsing for a transition everyone understands but no one openly discusses. Your father still dominates every mural, every newspaper headline, every classroom wall, yet your presence is no longer subtle. At the 6th Congress of the Workers' Party of Korea in 1980, you are publicly elevated to senior positions within the party's hierarchy, including membership in the Presidium of the Politburo. It is a formal signal to the elite. The line of succession is not theoretical. It is you. In a socialist system that once rejected dynasties as feudal relics, this is a remarkable transformation. But by now, the ideological groundwork has been laid so carefully that it feels almost inevitable. You move through offices lined with portraits of your father, reviewing reports from provincial committees and military units. The organisation and guidance department, which you have helped strengthen, functions as your instrument of calibration. Promotions, demotions, transfers, all flow through a structure you understand intimately. You learn that control is not loud, it is procedural. It is in the minutes of meetings, the wording of directives, the quiet reshuffling of commanders whose loyalty seems uncertain. By this point you have earned a reputation within the elite as disciplined, sometimes severe, and obsessively attentive to detail. The revolutionary king is aging. The apprentice must prove he can command without wobbling the throne. At the same time, you continue shaping culture with almost cinematic intensity. One of the most extraordinary episodes associated with you, widely reported by defectors and later confirmed by multiple sources, is the 1978 abduction of South Korean film director Shin Sang-ok and actress Choi Eun-hee. They are allegedly kidnapped and brought to North Korea to help revitalise the domestic film industry under your guidance. It sounds like a plot twist from a Cold War thriller, but it is rooted in documented events. You meet with Shin personally, urging him to create films that can compete internationally while still glorifying the regime. Under your patronage, he directs several productions, including a giant monster movie called Pulgasari, which some have described as North Korea's answer to Godzilla. There is something almost surreal about this, a future nuclear-armed leader obsessing over monster movies. Yet it reveals your belief that culture is strategic terrain. Meanwhile, the broader geopolitical landscape is shifting. The Soviet Union, under leaders like Leonid Brezhnev and later Mikhail Gorbachev, begins to stagnate and then reform. China, under Deng Xiaoping, opens its economy to market-oriented reforms. You watch these developments carefully. Reform brings growth, yes, but it also loosens ideological rigidity. In Pyongyang, loosening is synonymous with vulnerability. Your father's doctrine of Yuche, self-reliance, is reinforced, not relaxed. The state maintains strict control over information and borders. You absorb a crucial lesson. Ideological purity may be economically inefficient, but it preserves centralized authority. Inside North Korea, the 1980s bring grand construction projects and elaborate celebrations. Pyongyang's skyline rises with monuments and wide boulevards meant to symbolize socialist triumph. The Arch of Triumph is completed in 1982, commemorating your father's anti-Japanese resistance. It is deliberately taller than Paris's Arc de Triomphe, a subtle architectural boast. You oversee many such symbolic gestures, understanding that stone and concrete can communicate permanence. The 13th World Festival of Youth and Students in 1989 becomes a massive international showcase, drawing tens of thousands of visitors. Stadiums fill with synchronized performers. Fireworks bloom above carefully choreographed displays. For a moment, North Korea appears confident, modern, almost festive. Yet beneath the spectacle, economic cracks widen. The centrally planned system struggles with inefficiencies. Agricultural yields fluctuate. Dependence on Soviet aid remains significant. You study these vulnerabilities with the eye of someone who knows he will soon inherit them. Your father remains the face of the state, but insiders increasingly turn to you for guidance. Military commanders assess your priorities. Party cadres measure your tone. Authority is being transferred not in a single dramatic act, but through accumulated habit. There is also the matter of internal discipline. Throughout the 1980s, you reinforce ideological campaigns to ensure loyalty among youth and intellectuals. Study sessions intensify. Self-criticism meetings, where citizens publicly confess minor failings, continue as tools of social cohesion and surveillance. You recognize that fear need not always be brutal. It can be bureaucratic, woven into daily routine. People monitor themselves because the system has trained them to do so. It is an efficient form of control, though not a gentle one. By the early 1990s, the world outside begins to tilt dramatically. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. For North Korea, this is not just a distant geopolitical event, it is a seismic shock. A key ally and economic partner disappears almost overnight. Subsidized oil shipments falter. Trade networks disintegrate. You watch as the global socialist bloc fractures. China continues reforms, deepening market mechanisms that your father's ideology rejects. Isolation becomes more pronounced. If there was ever a moment to consider reform, it might have been now. But reform risks undermining the mythic continuity you have spent decades cultivating. In 1994, the inevitable occurs. Kim Il-sung dies of a heart attack at age 82. The announcement is broadcast with solemn gravity. Citizens weep publicly, some collapsing in grief that is both genuine and performative. You stand at the centre of a nation in mourning, inheriting not only power, but a colossal personality cult. One mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Following your father's death, you assume leadership as General Secretary of the Workers' Party and later as Chairman of the National Defence Commission, consolidating authority in your hands. Yet you do not immediately take the title of President. Instead, your father is declared the eternal President, preserving his symbolic supremacy even in death. It is a delicate manoeuvre, maintaining continuity while elevating yourself. The timing could hardly be worse. The economy is already under strain from the loss of Soviet support. Natural disasters soon compound the crisis. Floods in 1995 and 1996 devastate agricultural land. The public distribution system, which provides food rations to citizens, begins to falter. As the 1990s unfold, North Korea enters what it calls the Arduous March, a period of severe famine. Estimates of the death toll vary widely, ranging from hundreds of thousands to potentially over 1 million. Exact numbers remain contested due to limited access and state secrecy, but the suffering is undeniable. You now face the ultimate test of your apprenticeship. The myths, the parades, the carefully staged films, none of them can conjure grain from flooded fields. Yet your response is not to dismantle the system. Instead, you consolidate it further. The military becomes central under your Songun, or military first, policy. Resources are prioritized for armed forces, reinforcing loyalty among commanders who could otherwise become threats. The state tightens ideological messaging, framing hardship as a patriotic trial. Sacrifice becomes proof of devotion. It is here, in the crucible of famine and geopolitical isolation, that your character as ruler fully emerges. You have inherited not a stable socialist paradise, but a precarious fortress, and you choose to fortify rather than reform. The apprentice has become the master of a brittle kingdom, convinced that survival depends on unyielding control. The world outside shifts and globalizes, but within your borders, the script remains tightly edited, every frame aligned to preserve the dynasty you now embody. You inherit a nation already trembling, and the trembling does not stop when you take full control. It deepens, settles into bones, into empty grain silos, into the long silences between radio announcements. The mid to late 1990s become the crucible of your rule, the period that will define how you govern and how the world will remember you. The famine, officially framed as the Arduous March, invoking guerrilla hardship under Japanese occupation, is not a brief disruption, but a systemic collapse. Floods devastate crops, yes, but the deeper causes lie in structural weaknesses, over-reliance on centralized planning, heavy fertilizer dependency, loss of subsidized Soviet fuel, and the rigid public distribution system that cannot adapt when supplies thin out. You preside over this unravelling not as a distant bureaucrat, but as the supreme authority, and every decision, every refusal to pivot, carries enormous human weight. Mainstream historical estimates suggest that between 1994 and 1998, hundreds of thousands, and possibly over 1 million, North Koreans die from starvation and related illnesses. Exact numbers remain uncertain due to restricted data, but the demographic shock is real. In provincial towns, factories stop running, trains stall for lack of electricity, families quietly dismantle furniture to burn for heat, and yet, in Pyongyang, the core elite remains buffered. The capital continues to function as a carefully maintained showcase, while the countryside absorbs the worst of the crisis. You understand the hierarchy of survival. Loyalty is preserved where it matters most. Rather than dismantling central authority in response to the disaster, you tighten it. The military-first policy, Songun, becomes the organizing principle of your governance. Officially articulated more clearly in the late 1990s and early 2000s, its logic is straightforward. The Korean People's Army is the backbone of the state and must receive priority in resources and prestige. By elevating the military, you secure the loyalty of generals who control not just weapons, but logistics, labour units, and strategic industries. In a time of scarcity, favouring the armed forces sends a clear message about who stands closest to the regime's survival. It is a calculation rooted in hard realism. If the army remains loyal, the system endures. There is an almost paradoxical dynamic at play. While famine spreads, informal markets begin to sprout across the country. Known as Jangmadang, these black market spaces allow ordinary citizens, especially women, to trade food, clothing and small goods to survive. Initially tolerated as temporary coping mechanisms, they gradually become semi-permanent features of economic life. Here is one of those historical ironies. In a system that denounces capitalism, market behaviour quietly proliferates out of necessity. You permit it selectively, aware that outright suppression could provoke unrest, but you never allow it to mature into structural reform. The markets are safety valves, not policy shifts. At the same time, your regime's approach to information remains rigid. Radios are fixed to receive only state broadcasts. Travel between provinces requires permits. The border with China, though porous in some stretches, is heavily monitored. Defections increase during the famine years, as desperate citizens attempt to cross into Chinese territory in search of food. International aid organisations begin to enter North Korea in limited capacity, delivering grain and medical supplies. Accepting foreign assistance is ideologically uncomfortable, yet pragmatically necessary. You frame it as humanitarian cooperation, rather than dependence, careful to preserve the narrative of Yuchi self-reliance, even as external grain shipments arrive. Within the elite, discipline intensifies. You oversee purges and reshuffles designed to eliminate potential dissent. High-ranking officials accused of corruption or disloyalty are removed, sometimes disappearing from public life without explanation. The internal security apparatus, including the Ministry of State Security, remains vigilant. Fear is not always visible, but it is ambient. In a system where surveillance is woven into daily routine, even small deviations carry risk. You do not need constant public executions to maintain order, you need unpredictability. There is also a more personal dimension to your rule that emerges in this period, your cultivation of mystique. State media begins referring to you as the Dear Leader, a title that blends paternal warmth with unquestionable authority. Official biographies expand, recounting your supposed feats of strategic brilliance and cultural genius. Stories circulate that you composed operas in your youth or wrote thousands of books. One particularly famous and scientifically implausible claim suggests that you once scored multiple holes in one the first time you played golf. It is a quirky, almost absurd anecdote, but its purpose is not to persuade skeptics abroad, it is to reinforce the aura of extraordinary capability at home. In a closed information environment, repetition can transform exaggeration into accepted truth. Externally, you face mounting tension with the United States and regional powers over North Korea's nuclear ambitions. The seeds of this crisis were planted earlier, but in 1994, just before your father's death, North Korea and the United States signed the agreed framework, under which Pyongyang would freeze its plutonium program in exchange for energy assistance and the construction of light water reactors. As you consolidate power, the agreement remains fragile. Mutual distrust simmers. Inspectors monitor facilities, negotiations drag. You recognize the strategic value of ambiguity. Nuclear capability, even in nascent form, functions as deterrent leverage against a vastly more powerful adversary. The famine years, harsh as they are, also teach you something about endurance. The regime does not collapse. Predictions from foreign analysts that the state will implode under economic strain prove premature. The combination of ideological control, security enforcement, military loyalty, and limited market tolerance creates a grim equilibrium. Citizens adapt. They barter, forage, improvise. The state adjusts just enough to prevent total breakdown while preserving central authority. It is not prosperity, but it is survival. By the early 2000s, conditions begin to stabilize somewhat. International aid, modest economic adjustments, and improved harvests alleviate the most acute starvation. You shift focus more openly to strategic development. The military first line evolves into a broader emphasis on defense capabilities. Missile tests attract global headlines. Each launch over the Sea of Japan, or East Sea depending on perspective, sends a signal not only to Seoul and Tokyo, but to Washington. You are no longer merely managing crisis. You are shaping a narrative of defiance. There is a psychological thread running through all of this. Having witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union and the economic transformation of China, you appear convinced that loosening political control is existentially dangerous. Reform could unravel the mythic continuity of your dynasty. So instead, you double down on centralized authority while allowing narrow economic breathing spaces. It is a balancing act, precarious but deliberate. As the decade turns, the famine's immediate horror recedes, but its scars remain embedded in the population's memory. Entire cohorts grow up marked by malnutrition. Social trust shifts subtly as survival strategies reshape relationships. And you, having navigated one of the gravest crises in your nation's history without relinquishing power, emerge with a hardened governing style. The apprentice who once studied propaganda and party procedure has become a leader defined by endurance, suspicion, and strategic brinkmanship. The state survives, thinner, more brittle, but intact, and you stand at its centre, preparing for the next confrontation on a stage that is no longer merely domestic, but unmistakably global. You pivot from mere survival to calculated confrontation, and by the early 2000s, the world begins watching you not as the steward of a famine-stricken state, but as the architect of a nuclear gamble. The logic, from your vantage point, is cold and methodical. You have seen what happens to regimes that lack deterrence. Iraq is invaded in 2003. Leaders who once commanded armies are dragged from hiding places. The message, as you interpret it, is unmistakable. Without a credible strategic weapon, sovereignty can evaporate. So, you elevate the nuclear program from guarded ambiguity to central doctrine, weaving it tightly into your military-first policy. The roots of North Korea's nuclear ambitions stretch back decades to Soviet-assisted research reactors and early scientific exchanges. But under your leadership, the program becomes an explicit bargaining chip and shield. In 2002, tensions escalate when the United States accuses North Korea of pursuing a covert uranium enrichment program, effectively unraveling the 1994 agreed framework. Inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency are expelled. The Yongbyon nuclear facilities, once frozen, are reactivated. It is a deliberate escalation. You understand the power of unpredictability. It keeps adversaries off balance. In 2003, North Korea withdraws from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, becoming the first country to do so. This is not merely a technical maneuver, it is a statement of defiance. The six-party talks, involving North Korea, South Korea, China, Japan, Russia, and the United States, begin later that year, aiming to negotiate denuclearization in exchange for security guarantees and economic aid. You approach these talks not as a supplicant, but as a strategist. Each concession is weighed against regime survival. Agreements are signed, then strained, then revived. It becomes a rhythm, tension, negotiation, partial compliance, renewed tension. Critics abroad call it brinkmanship. From your perspective, it is leverage. Then, in October 2006, the moment arrives that shifts the global narrative decisively. North Korea conducts its first underground nuclear test. Seismic waves ripple through the Earth, detected by monitoring stations across the world. The yield appears relatively small, but the political shock is enormous. You have crossed a threshold. Sanctions tighten under United Nations Security Council resolutions. Diplomatic condemnation is swift. Yet within your borders, the test is framed as a historic triumph, proof that a small, isolated nation can stand shoulder to shoulder with major powers. The message to your people is simple. Endurance has produced strength. There is something almost theatrical in how these developments unfold. Missile launches follow, some failing spectacularly, others travelling farther with each iteration. Engineers refine designs. Military parades display mock-ups of new systems. Each vehicle rolling past reviewing stands beneath your watchful gaze. You cultivate an image of calm authority, inspecting launch sites, offering on-the-spot guidance to scientists in white lab coats. The state media describes you as a master strategist, personally guiding technological breakthroughs. Whether you are deeply versed in nuclear physics is less relevant than the perception that nothing moves without your approval. At the same time, you engage in a peculiar form of diplomatic choreography. In 2000, even before the first nuclear test, you host South Korean President Kim Dae-jung in Pyongyang for the first ever inter-Korean summit. The meeting, part of the South Sunshine Policy, results in emotional family reunions and cautious economic cooperation projects like the Kaesong Industrial Complex. For a brief period, hope flickers that reconciliation might soften decades of hostility. You appear on television smiling, shaking hands, projecting statesmanship. Yet this outreach does not replace your deterrent strategy, it complements it. Engagement brings economic opportunity and political breathing room, while nuclear development ensures security. Here lies the paradox of your rule in this era. Isolation and interaction proceed simultaneously. You allow limited tourism to Mount Kumgang, you send athletes to international competitions, yet information within the country remains tightly controlled. Mobile phones are introduced experimentally in the early 2000s, then abruptly banned after reports that they were used to spread news of a train explosion in 2004. The ban illustrates your underlying caution. Connectivity is power, and uncontrolled power is risk. Internally, you continue managing the elite with precision. Military leaders are promoted and reshuffled. Party officials rotate through key positions. You balance institutions against one another to prevent any single faction from accumulating excessive influence. The military-first policy ensures generals remain invested in the system's continuity, but you also avoid allowing them to overshadow party structures entirely. It is a delicate equilibrium maintained through constant vigilance. A quirky but revealing detail from these years involves your reputed culinary and luxury tastes. Defectors and former chefs recount elaborate banquets featuring imported delicacies, fine French cognac, and specially sourced ingredients flown in despite sanctions. While ordinary citizens face economic constraints, you reportedly cultivate a palate that reflects global reach. The contrast is stark, though rarely visible domestically. State media never shows excess. It shows you in modest settings, offering guidance in factories or at construction sites. The mythology demands discipline, not decadence. Meanwhile, sanctions begin to bite more sharply. Financial restrictions limit access to international banking. Trade narrows. China becomes increasingly central as North Korea's primary economic partner, providing fuel and food assistance even as it expresses frustration over nuclear tests. You maneuver carefully, aware that alienating Beijing entirely would be perilous, yet you also resist appearing subordinate. Independence, Juche, remains the ideological anchor. In 2009, North Korea conducts a second nuclear test, more powerful than the first. Missile launches accompany it, reinforcing the message that your deterrent is maturing. International analysts debate whether these moves are defensive or coercive. From within your strategic worldview, the distinction blurs. A credible nuclear capability deters invasion, commands attention, and elevates your bargaining position. It also reshapes regional security dynamics, prompting neighbouring states to enhance missile defences and deepen alliances. Your actions ripple outward, altering calculations far beyond Pyongyang. As the years progress, questions about your health begin circulating abroad. Reports surface of a stroke in 2008, though details remain opaque. You appear less frequently in public for a time, then re-emerge, thinner but resolute. The issue of succession, once distant, begins to re-enter the conversation. You have sons, but none have been publicly groomed as clearly as you were. The system you inherited was carefully engineered. The system you will pass on requires similar preparation. By the end of the 2000s, North Korea stands transformed. Economically constrained, diplomatically isolated, yet undeniably nuclear capable, it occupies a unique position on the global stage. You have steered it through famine, navigated post-Cold War upheaval, and crossed the nuclear threshold. Critics label you reckless. Supporters within your borders hail you as a defender of sovereignty. The truth lies somewhere in the intersection of fear and strategy. You have chosen deterrence over reform, spectacle over transparency, control over liberalisation. And as you look ahead, aware of your own mortality more keenly than before, the question shifts from how to wield power to how to secure it beyond yourself. The dynasty must not fracture. The myth must not fade. The nuclear shield, now forged, must remain intact. The next act is already forming in your mind, not only about weapons or negotiations, but about bloodline, continuity, and the preservation of a system built as much on story as on steel. You begin to think not only about missiles and negotiations, but about inheritance. Power, you have learned, is not secured merely through force. It must be narrated, ritualized, and transferred with care. By the late 2000s, whispers about your health circulate beyond your borders and inevitably within them. Reports of a stroke in 2008, never fully confirmed in detail by your government, trigger speculation abroad that the regime might fracture. But fracture is precisely what you cannot allow. The system has survived famine, sanctions, and isolation. It must now survive succession. Unlike your own ascent, which unfolded gradually over decades under the careful orchestration of your father, the grooming of your successor accelerates under compressed time. Of your sons, Kim Jong-nam, Kim Jong-chul, and Kim Jong-un, it is the youngest who emerges as the chosen heir. Kim Jong-nam, once considered a possibility, fell from favour years earlier after being detained in Japan in 2001, while attempting to visit Tokyo Disneyland with a forged passport, a detail that sounds almost comedic but carried serious political embarrassment. Kim Jong-chul, according to reports, was deemed too soft for leadership. Whether these assessments were strategic or personal, the outcome is clear. Kim Jong-un becomes the focus. In 2010, at a rare party conference, Kim Jong-un is publicly introduced to the North Korean elite and promoted to high-ranking positions, including Vice Chairman of the Central Military Commission. He is in his late 20s, largely unknown to the outside world. The resemblance to you at a similar age is striking, the same round face, the same carefully styled hair. The visual continuity is not accidental, it is symbolic, designed to reassure the elite and the population that the bloodline remains intact. You understand the power of imagery better than most leaders, you have built a career on it. This period also sees continued military posturing. In 2010, tensions spike dramatically on the Korean peninsula. In March, the South Korean naval vessel Cheonan sinks near the disputed maritime border, killing 46 sailors. An international investigation concludes that a North Korean torpedo was responsible, a claim your government denies. Later that year, North Korea shells Yeonpyeong Island, prompting return fire from South Korean forces. The incidents underscore the volatility of the region and reinforce your strategy of calibrated provocation. Confrontation keeps your adversaries cautious. It reminds them that stability on the peninsula cannot be taken for granted. At the same time, you oversee limited economic adjustments. Special economic zones are discussed and, in some cases, expanded. The Kaesong Industrial Complex continues operating intermittently, employing North Korean workers in South Korean-funded factories just north of the border. It represents one of the few sustained inter-Korean cooperative ventures. You tolerate it because it brings hard currency and does not fundamentally threaten centralized control. Economic experimentation remains tightly circumscribed. The Jangmadang markets, once informal survival tools during the famine, are now semi-entrenched features of daily life. The state oscillates between crackdowns and accommodation, aware that these markets have become essential to household survival. There is also the matter of your personal mystique, which by now has crystallized into legend. State narratives describe you as an unparalleled military strategist, a cultural genius, a benevolent father to the nation. Official media recounts your on-the-spot guidance visits in meticulous detail, down to the expressions on factory workers' faces as you offer advice. A curious tidbit often repeated domestically claims that your birth caused ice on Mount Paktu to crack with a thunderous roar, heralding a new era. Such mythic flourishes serve a clear purpose. They elevate leadership beyond ordinary scrutiny. In a society where dissent is dangerous, myth is stabilizing. Externally, the nuclear program continues advancing, even as negotiations wax and wane. Though your first and second nuclear tests occurred in 2006 and 2009, the infrastructure and expertise behind them deepen through sustained investment. Missile technology improves incrementally. Each launch, successful or not, contributes data. Sanctions intensify, targeting financial networks and luxury goods imports. Yet enforcement is uneven, and cross-border trade with China persists. You operate within these constraints, extracting advantage where possible, avoiding total isolation while never relinquishing your deterrent. Health concerns, however, remain an undercurrent. Photographs show you appearing thinner at times, then heavier at others. Public appearances are carefully staged. When you vanish from view for weeks, speculation surges abroad. Within North Korea, information remains controlled. Rumours rarely circulate widely without consequence. You appear again, smiling, inspecting troops or visiting construction sites, signalling continuity. But privately, succession planning accelerates. Kim Jong-un is granted the rank of general despite limited military experience. Senior officials are instructed to pledge loyalty to him. The process mirrors your own grooming decades earlier, but condensed. In 2011, the inevitable arrives. On December 17, while reportedly travelling by train, a preferred mode of transport for security reasons, you suffer a heart attack and die at age 69 or 70, depending on which birth year one accepts. The announcement of your death is broadcast 2 days later in a sombre tone. State television shows a news anchor struggling to contain emotion as she delivers the news. Citizens gather in public squares, many weeping openly. As with your father's death in 1994, grief is both personal and performative. In a system where loyalty is expressed collectively, mourning becomes a public ritual. You are declared the Eternal General Secretary of the Workers' Party, echoing the eternal presidency bestowed upon your father. The symbolism is deliberate. Leadership may pass to the living, but authority remains anchored in the lineage. Kim Jong-un steps forward swiftly, consolidating titles and military backing. The transition, though rapid, is remarkably smooth by authoritarian standards. There are no visible coups, no open power struggles. The elite, conditioned for decades to equate stability with dynastic continuity, align themselves with the new leader. Looking back across your tenure, the pattern is unmistakable. You inherited a fragile state at a moment of global transformation. You confronted famine, international isolation, and the collapse of traditional allies. Rather than liberalise, you fortified. Rather than decentralise, you centralised further. You cultivated nuclear weapons not as symbols of aggression alone, but as insurance policies. You invested in myth as diligently as in missiles. Your governance style was not improvisational, it was strategic, rooted in a worldview shaped by war, ideological struggle, and the cautionary tales of fallen regimes. The world beyond your borders remains divided in its assessment. Some view you as reckless, responsible for deepening suffering through rigid policy. Others see you as a shrewd survivor who preserved his state against overwhelming odds. Inside North Korea, your image is curated as heroic, paternal, indispensable. The truth, as always, is layered. You were a product of Soviet exile, guerrilla mythology, Cold War geopolitics, and post-Cold War anxiety. You were both student and architect of a system that fused socialism with dynasty. And as your body is laid to rest in the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, embalmed and displayed beside your father, the narrative you spent decades shaping does not end. It transitions. the sun becomes the leader. The myth renews itself. The nuclear shield remains raised. The story, once born beneath disputed skies, continues, not as a footnote, but as an ongoing chapter in the uneasy history of a divided peninsula. You drift now into the long echo of what you built, because even after your heart stops somewhere between railway stations and winter fields, the architecture of your rule keeps breathing. The cameras linger on your glass, encased body in the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, the same vast mausoleum that holds your father. Soldiers stand rigid. Citizens file past in orchestrated waves of grief. Outside, snow gathers softly on Pyongyang's wide avenues, and loudspeakers murmur songs of loyalty. The pacing of the state slows for mourning, but it never truly pauses. Systems like yours are designed precisely to outlive individuals. That, perhaps, is the most consequential part of your legacy. You spent decades ensuring that leadership in North Korea was not merely political, but hereditary, mythic, almost sacred. By the time of your death in December 2011, the transfer of authority to Kim Jong-un unfolds with remarkable speed. Within days, he is proclaimed Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. Within months, he accumulates the key party and military titles necessary to consolidate power. Observers abroad had speculated that such a young, relatively inexperienced figure might struggle to command loyalty. Yet the institutional scaffolding you refined, the organisation and guidance department, the military-first ethos, the ritualised cult of personality functions as intended. The elite rallies, the general's salute, the narrative continues. One mainstream historical fact anchors this transition. In April 2012, Kim Jong-un is formally named first Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea and first Chairman of the National Defense Commission, later restructuring titles but preserving centralised authority. The hereditary principle, once an ideological contradiction in a Marxist-Leninist framework, has become normalised reality. You succeeded in transforming a revolutionary state into a dynastic one, without openly abandoning its ideological vocabulary. That synthesis, socialism fused with bloodline, remains one of your most distinctive political innovations. And yet, your shadow does not simply fade, it lingers in policy. The nuclear doctrine you advanced continues to shape North Korea's trajectory. Under your successor, additional nuclear tests occur, missile ranges extend dramatically, and the strategic deterrent you nurtured matures into intercontinental capability. Analysts trace the lineage of these developments back through laboratories and launch sites to your era of foundational testing. The logic you embraced, that nuclear weapons are the ultimate guarantor of regime survival, remains embedded in state thinking. Whether one sees this as prudent or perilous, it is undeniably enduring. Your economic legacy is more ambiguous. The Jangmadang markets that expanded during the famine years do not disappear after your death, they become more entrenched. Limited marketization deepens in practice, if not in official rhetoric. Scholars often describe North Korea's economy as a hybrid, centrally planned in theory, partially marketized in everyday life. That hybridization began as a coping mechanism under your watch. You did not design it as reform, but you tolerated it as necessity. In that sense, even unintended adaptations form part of your inheritance. There is also the human dimension, harder to quantify, but essential. Generations who lived through the arduous march carry memories of scarcity that shape behaviour long after harvests improve. Trust in the public distribution system never fully returns. Informal networks, barter habits, and cautious pragmatism remain woven into daily life. While the state narrative emphasises resilience and loyalty, private memory may hold more complicated reflections. History, after all, is not only written in textbooks, it is carried quietly in households. A curious and telling tidbit from the years following your death involves the persistence of mythic storytelling. Official biographies continue to expand tales of your genius, recounting miraculous feats, artistic brilliance, strategic foresight. Even anecdotes that outsiders might view skeptically, such as your supposed supernatural birth signs or extraordinary athletic prowess, remain embedded in domestic media. Myth, once institutionalized, does not easily unwind. It becomes tradition, and tradition, especially in closed systems, is powerful glue. Beyond North Korea's borders, your reputation crystallizes into a symbol of enigmatic authoritarianism. Documentaries dissect your film obsessions. Memoirs from defectors recount the rigidities and contradictions of life under your rule. Diplomats recall tense negotiations punctuated by sudden reversals. You become shorthand in international discourse for nuclear brinkmanship. Yet caricature often flattens complexity. You are neither merely irrational nor purely calculating. You are shaped by a lifetime of observing collapse and control, by the trauma of war and the cautionary tales of toppled regimes. If one steps back, just slightly, as if viewing the Korean peninsula from high above, your life traces an arc across some of the 20th and early 21st century's most turbulent chapters. Born amid World War II in Soviet exile, raised during the Korean War's devastation, matured through the Cold War's rigid blocks, and ruled through the post-Cold War's ideological fragmentation, you embodied continuity in a region defined by division. The demilitarized zone remains one of the most fortified borders on Earth. Families separated since 1953 still await reunions. Your decisions did not create that division, but they entrenched its permanence. Now, as the narrative softens and the night deepens, you can almost feel the weight of decades settling into stillness. Imagine the train carriage where your life ended, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on track, the muted winter landscape sliding past. There is something oddly intimate about that image. Not a battlefield, not a grand stage, but a moving compartment in a country stitched together by rails and ideology. Power, for all its spectacle, ultimately rests in quiet rooms and private moments. You leave behind a nation that is isolated yet resilient, constrained yet adaptive, myth-laden yet materially real. You leave behind a dynasty that continues to command absolute authority within its borders. You leave behind nuclear capabilities that ensure North Korea remains central in global security conversations. And you leave behind unanswered questions about what might have been different had reform been chosen over rigidity, openness over insulation. History rarely offers clear alternate paths. It offers consequences. As we ease toward the final stretch of this journey, let the images slow. The parades fade into distant echoes. The missile launches dissolve into silent arcs across dark skies. Snow falls gently on Mount Paktu, whether or not you were truly born there, and the mountain stands indifferent to human myth. The lights of Pyongyang glow against the winter night, steady and contained. Somewhere beyond the horizon, families on both sides of the border lie down to sleep, their lives shaped in ways large and small by choices made decades ago. And you, listener, breathing softly in your own quiet space, can let the tension of geopolitics drift for a moment. The story of Kim Jong-il is not a bedtime fairy tale. It is a study in power, survival, and the stories states tell about themselves. It reminds you how fragile systems can be, and how fiercely they can cling to continuity. It reminds you that history is made not only by battles and treaties, but by narratives repeated until they harden into belief. So now, let the night settle fully. Let the heavy machinery of ideology and strategy fade into the background hum of distant history. The trains have stopped. The speeches have ended. The snow keeps falling, quiet and patient. And in that stillness, you can close your eyes, knowing that even the most formidable regimes are, in the end, chapters in a much longer human story, one that continues, slowly and strangely, long after any single leader's voice has gone silent.